He stood near the window, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. But the whiskey did nothing to settle his nerves. Tomorrow he was getting married. To a woman the world would never approve of. A small-town girl. A nobody. The whispers had started long before the engagement. Why would a billionaire, heir to the Montgomery Empire, throw away his status for a woman who had nothing to her name? His mother had nearly collapsed when she found out. His friends had laughed, claiming he was just rebelling against his world of privilege. But Lucas didn't care. He had made up his mind. He met Emily in the most unexpected way. A business trip had led him to a quiet countryside town when his car broke down in the middle of nowhere. She had been working in a local cafe, serving him coffee without realizing who he was. That was the first thing that had intrigued him. She hadn't fawned over his name, hadn't been blinded by his wealth. She treated him like any other stranger. And for the first time in his life, Lucas had felt seen. He kept coming back. At first, it was just an excuse to escape the exhausting world of corporate politics and power plays. But soon he realized it was more than that. It was her kindness, her warmth, the way she never looked at him with expectations. So against every rule written for men like him, he asked her to marry him. Emily had been hesitant. She didn't understand why a billionaire would want someone like her. But Lucas had reassured her, promised her that what he felt was real, that their love was real. And eventually she said yes. But now as the wedding day arrived, he couldn't shake off a feeling in the pit of his stomach. Emily had never talked about her past. There were no family members at the wedding, no childhood friends. When he had asked if she wanted to bring someone, she had simply smiled and said, "There's no one left." Lucas had accepted it without question. But tonight, as they stepped into their lavish honeymoon suite, something felt off. Emily stood near the door, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the golden bracelet he had given her that morning. She looked hesitant, almost afraid. "Emily," Lucas said softly, stepping toward her. "What's wrong?" She exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on the fabric of her dress. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "there's something I need to tell you." A chill ran down his spine. She lifted her gaze to meet his, her blue eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, regret, sorrow. "I should have told you before," she continued, her voice shaking. "But I didn't know how." Lucas's throat went dry. "Told me what?" She hesitated, and then finally the words left her lips. "I'm not who you think I am." The room suddenly felt colder, and as she prepared to reveal the secret she had kept buried for years, Lucas had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse. Lucas's breath hitched as he took a step closer. The way Emily stood there trembling, gripping her bracelet like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality, it sent a cold shiver down his spine. "Emily," he said, his voice quieter now, more careful. "What are you talking about?" She exhaled as if she had been holding this weight inside her for too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I wasn't born in that small town, Lucas," she said, her eyes darting to the floor. "That wasn't my real home." His pulse quickened. "Then where?" She swallowed hard, hesitating. He could see the war within her, the way she was struggling to find the right words, as if no matter how she said it, it wouldn't be enough. "I was hidden there," she admitted finally, "to keep me safe." Lucas felt a sharp sting of confusion. "Safe from what?" Emily's hands clenched into fists. "From the people who destroyed my family." Silence stretched between them. Lucas's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle she had just thrown at him. "What do you mean, destroyed?" His voice was cautious, but beneath it was a storm of uncertainty. She lifted her gaze, and for the first time he saw it. The raw pain in her expression. The kind of pain that didn't just come from loss, but from a lifetime of running. "I was born into a powerful family," she finally admitted. "A family that had everything. Influence, wealth, respect. But one night, it all vanished." Lucas's grip on reality tightened. "My father was murdered," she continued, her voice hollow. "My mother disappeared. My entire family was erased, and I was the only one who survived." A thick silence filled the room. Lucas felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. You, you were the only one left? Emily nodded. I was a child when it happened. They took everything from me. My name, my home, my future. I was hidden away in that town, forced to live a life that wasn't mine, because if they ever found out I was still alive. She trailed off, her hands shaking. Lucas's mind raced. None of this made sense. Who did this? He asked, his voice barely steady. Emily's lips parted, but she hesitated again. The moment stretched between them, suffocating. You know them, she whispered. Lucas's stomach twisted. Her voice trembled as she forced the words out. You do business with them. His world tilted. He blinked. What? Emily sucked in a sharp breath, her gaze locking onto his. And then finally she said it. The Montgomerys. Everything inside Lucas froze. His heart pounded in his chest, but his body felt paralyzed. The Montgomerys. His family. His father. His uncles. The empire they had built from the ground up. A dark, merciless legacy. No, he whispered, shaking his head. That's not possible. Emily took a slow step forward, her voice trembling. It is, Lucas, she whispered. Your family is the reason mine was destroyed. His breathing became uneven. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His father, the man who had raised him with an iron fist, the man who had taught him that power was everything. Had he done this? Had his family wiped out another dynasty? Killed an entire bloodline? Leaving only a little girl to survive? Lucas ran a hand through his hair, stepping back, his pulse wild. This doesn't make sense. Why would they? Because my father was a threat to them, Emily interrupted, her voice raw with emotion. Because he knew something they didn't want the world to know. And when they couldn't control him, they erased him. Lucas felt a violent nausea building in his stomach. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He demanded. Emily swallowed. Because I was afraid. He clenched his jaw. Afraid of what? She hesitated. Afraid that you already knew. Lucas's chest tightened, his vision blurred for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a crushing force. Then, the door creaked open. Emily flinched. Lucas turned sharply, and standing in the doorway, his expression dark and unreadable, was his father. Lucas felt a slow, suffocating weight press against his chest as he locked eyes with his father. Richard Montgomery stood there in the dimly lit doorway, his presence alone enough to suck the air out of the room. He wasn't a man easily startled, nor one who made unplanned appearances, which meant he knew. Emily's fingers dug into the fabric of her dress as she instinctively took a step back. Lucas felt the tension radiating from her, but he couldn't take his eyes off his father. Richard, Lucas said, his voice steady, but his hands were clenched at his sides. What are you doing here? His father took a slow step into the room, his gaze flickering toward Emily, cold and calculating. Then, without answering, he shut the door behind him with a quiet click. Lucas's stomach tightened. You've been busy, son, Richard finally spoke, his voice as smooth as ever, as if they were discussing a business deal. Though I suppose I should have expected that. Lucas's jaw locked. What does that mean? Richard took another step forward, his hands clasped behind his back, posture unreadable. It means, he said, eyes shifting back to Emily, that I had a feeling this day might come, that the past has a way of creeping back, no matter how well you bury it. Emily stiffened. Lucas saw the way her knuckles turned white as she clenched her fists. Is it true? Lucas demanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. What she said, that our family, he stopped, correcting himself. You destroyed hers? Richard exhaled slowly, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. It's a complicated story, Lucas, he said, his voice frustratingly calm. Then simplify it, Lucas snapped. Richard studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Her father was a problem, he admitted, a dangerous man despite what she might believe. He had information that could have jeopardized everything, the entire foundation of our empire. He wasn't just a businessman, Lucas. He was someone who could have unraveled everything we built. Emily took a step forward, her voice shaking with fury. My father was murdered in cold blood, she hissed, because he refused to be controlled. And my mother, her voice broke. She disappeared because of you. Richard didn't flinch. Your mother was given a choice, he said simply. She could have left with you. She could have walked away. She chose otherwise. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Lucas felt like the ground beneath him was cracking apart. He couldn't process it, couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him about loyalty, strength, and the power of the Montgomery name, was admitting to all of this so easily. You killed them, Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. You destroyed an entire family. Richard turned to face him fully now, his expression unreadable. I protected ours. A silence stretched between them, so thick it was suffocating. Lucas felt something shift inside him, something irreparable. His whole life, he had believed in his family's empire, believed in the power and legacy of the Montgomery name. But now as he stood there, staring at the man he once idolized, all he saw was a ruthless king who had built his throne on the ashes of others. You lied to me, Lucas said, his voice laced with quiet betrayal. Richard exhaled. You were never supposed to know. Lucas's fist clenched. Let me guess, Emily said bitterly. Now that I've told him, you're going to make sure I disappear too? Richard tilted his head slightly, as if considering the possibility. That depends, he said evenly. Lucas's blood turned to ice. It was the way he said it. No anger, no threat. Just a simple statement. That depends. And in that moment, Lucas understood something. His father had no intention of letting Emily leave this room alive. His stomach twisted violently. No, he said suddenly, stepping in front of her. That's not happening. Richard sighed as if disappointed. Lucas, I said no. Lucas cut him off, his voice cold and final. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Richard's eyes. Then he straightened, nodding once. Very well, he said. Lucas barely had a second to process those words before Richard moved. It was fast. Too fast. Before he could react, his father pulled something from his jacket. Something small, metallic. A gun. Lucas's heart slammed against his ribs as Richard raised the weapon, his expression unreadable. Emily gasped. Lucas moved without thinking. And then, a deafening shot rang out. The gunshot shattered the heavy silence, echoing through the suite like a crack of thunder. Lucas's body moved on instinct, lunging forward, but he wasn't fast enough. Emily gasped sharply beside him, stumbling back as the sound of the bullet rang in her ears. For a brief, horrifying moment, Lucas thought she had been hit. His chest tightened, his heart pounding so violently it felt like it might burst. But then, as the smoke cleared, he realized. Richard hadn't fired at Emily. The bullet had lodged itself into the wall behind them, inches away from Lucas's head. A warning shot. His father's hand was steady as he lowered the gun slightly, his expression unreadable. Think carefully, Lucas, Richard said, his voice calm, almost patient. You don't understand what you're doing. Lucas's breath came in short, sharp bursts. His mind was racing, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to react if Richard so much as moved his finger toward the trigger again. Emily was frozen, eyes locked onto the gun in Richard's hand, her face pale as a ghost. Lucas forced himself to step in front of her, shielding her from his father's line of sight. You're insane, he hissed, his voice shaking with fury. She's my wife, Richard scoffed. She's a problem. Lucas clenched his jaw. She's a person. His father exhaled sharply as if Lucas's defiance was merely an inconvenience. And what exactly do you plan to do? Richard asked, tilting his head slightly. Throw your life away for her? Turn your back on everything? Lucas didn't hesitate. If it means protecting her from you? Yes. A flicker of something passed through Richard's cold, calculating eyes. Disappointment. Then almost casually, he lifted the gun again. Lucas's muscles tensed, ready to move. But before Richard could pull the trigger, the door to the suite suddenly burst open. Drop it! The commanding voice sent a jolt through Lucas. 3 men stormed into the room, Guns drawn, their movements precise and controlled. For a split second, Lucas thought they were Richard's men, that his father had come prepared to finish this himself. But then he saw the emblem on their jackets. FBI. Emily let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling. Richard's fingers flexed around the gun, his expression hardening. "Don't be stupid, Richard," one of the agents warned, stepping forward. "It's over." Lucas's heart was still hammering as he tried to process what was happening. "Emily," he said slowly, turning to her. "What did you do?" She swallowed hard, her blue eyes filled with emotion. "I told you, Lucas," she whispered. "I wasn't going to run this time." His mind reeled. She had called them. She had known this moment would come. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "I had to stop him." Lucas turned back to his father, watching as Richard took a slow step back, his face eerily calm despite the guns aimed at him. "You betrayed me," Richard said simply. Lucas's jaw tightened. "No," he corrected. "I finally saw you for who you really are." Richard exhaled, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he carefully placed the gun on the table and lifted his hands in surrender. The agents moved in instantly, pinning his arms behind his back as they cuffed him. Lucas watched as they led his father away. But even as Richard disappeared through the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Emily turned to him, her breath still unsteady. "It's over, Lucas," she whispered. He wanted to believe her, but deep down he knew this was only the beginning. Lucas stood frozen, his mind racing as the reality of what had just happened crashed down on him. His father, Richard Montgomery, the untouchable force who had built an empire on secrets, power, and destruction, was finally in handcuffs. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like justice. But all he felt was numb. Emily's hands were still shaking as she reached for him. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice raw, fragile. "Say something." He turned to her, searching her eyes for something. Reassurance, understanding, an explanation for why she had kept this from him. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "How long have you been planning this?" She hesitated, but there was no point in hiding the truth now. "Since the moment I realized who you were," she admitted. "Since the moment I knew your father was the man I'd been running from my entire life." Lucas inhaled sharply, stepping away from her touch. His chest ached with something he couldn't name. Betrayal, guilt, devastation. "You used me," he said quietly. Emily's face paled. "No." "You got close to me to get to him," Lucas pressed, his voice shaking. "This wasn't about love. This was about revenge." Her breath hitched. "At first," she whispered, "maybe. I don't know. But Lucas, I swear, it became real. I fell in love with you. I tried to walk away from this, but I couldn't. Not after everything he did." Lucas clenched his jaw, turning away. "And what about me?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Did I ever even matter? Or was I just another part of your plan?" Emily stepped forward, desperation in her voice. "You were never part of the plan," she pleaded. "I never expected to love you, but I did. I do." Lucas shook his head. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. His father, the man who had shaped him, for better or worse, was a monster. And the woman he had trusted, the woman he had risked everything for, had been lying to him all along. Emily's voice cracked. "I didn't want to hurt you, Lucas." "But you did," he shot back. "You made me choose between you and my own blood. You forced me to stand there and watch my father be dragged away like a criminal." "Because he is a criminal." Emily's voice rose, her eyes flashing with emotion. "Lucas, your family destroyed mine. My father didn't deserve to die. My mother didn't deserve to vanish into nothing. And she choked on her words. "I didn't deserve to live my life in hiding like I was the one who did something wrong." Lucas clenched his fists, his breath coming in uneven bursts. Everything she said was true, and yet it didn't make this any easier. "I need time," he finally said, his voice quieter now. Emily's eyes filled with pain. "Lucas, he exhaled sharply. "I don't know how to process this. I don't know how to look at you and not see the person who destroyed my father." Emily flinched as if he had struck her. He swallowed hard, his mind spinning. "I need to get out of here." He turned toward the door, his footsteps heavy, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Lucas, wait!" Emily called after him, but he didn't stop. Because if he did, if he turned around and looked at her again, he wasn't sure what choice he would make. And right now, he wasn't sure if he could survive making the wrong one. Lucas drove aimlessly through the city streets, his mind spiraling in a whirlwind of emotions. Rage, confusion, betrayal. The weight of the night pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. His father was gone, arrested. The empire he had once admired, the legacy he had believed in, now felt like a fortress built on blood and lies. And Emily? He gritted his teeth, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to believe she had played him from the start, that everything between them had been a carefully crafted deception. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. She had loved him. He had seen it in her eyes, felt it in the way she held him, in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. But love didn't change what she had done. His father was a monster, but he was still his father, the man who had raised him, who had taught him how to navigate the ruthless world of power and influence. Now he was gone, and Lucas had been the one to help take him down. He didn't know who he was without him. The car slowed as he approached the Montgomery estate, the place he had grown up in, the place that had once symbolized everything he was supposed to become. But tonight it felt different, empty, cold. The massive iron gates were open, the security lights casting long shadows over the perfectly trimmed hedges. Lucas parked, stepping out into the crisp night air. His footsteps echoed on the marble driveway as he approached the front entrance. He hesitated for a moment before pushing the heavy doors open. The house was eerily quiet. Without his father's presence, it felt dead. Lucas wandered through the grand hall, past the gilded portraits of past Montgomery men, past the luxurious decor that suddenly felt meaningless. In his father's office, the room where so many powerful deals had been made, he sank into the leather chair behind the massive oak desk. His fingers traced the smooth surface, and for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder. Who was he, if not his father's heir? A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Lucas turned, his heart pounding. Emily. She stood there, hesitant, her face pale, her eyes filled with uncertainty. He exhaled sharply. "What are you doing here?" She took a step inside, her voice quiet. "I had to see you." Lucas leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "Emily, I told you, I need time." "I know," she whispered, "but I don't have time, Lucas." His eyes snapped to hers. "What?" She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting together. "I thought it was over. I thought with your father gone, I'd finally be free." Lucas sat up straighter, the unease in his stomach returning. "Emily," he said cautiously, "what are you talking about?" She hesitated, then said the words that made his blood run cold. He wasn't the only one involved. Lucas's entire body tensed. Emily took another step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are others. People who helped cover up what happened to my family. People who will do anything to make sure the truth never comes out." Lucas felt a slow, sinking dread settle over him. He had spent his entire life believing his family was untouchable, but now for the first time, he realized his father might have been the king. But there were other players in the game, and if Emily was right, they were coming. Lucas felt a cold dread crawl up his spine as Emily's words sank in. There are others. His entire world had already shifted tonight, but now he realized his father's arrest wasn't the end of this nightmare. It was just the beginning. He stared at Emily, searching her face for something. Certainty, fear, desperation. He saw all three. "Who?" he asked, his voice low. "Who else is involved?" Emily hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be lurking in the shadows. "I don't know all their names," she admitted. "But your father, he wasn't acting alone. There were others protecting him, powerful people who have just as much to lose now that the truth is coming out." Lucas clenched his fists. "And they'll come after you," he said grimly. Emily swallowed hard. They already have. His heart pounded. What do you mean? She hesitated. After the wedding, after I told you everything, I got a call, a blocked number. At first I thought it was nothing, but then, she took a shaky breath. A car was following me, Lucas, all the way to my apartment. I tried to lose them, but they knew where I lived. And when I finally got home, she paused, her voice breaking. My apartment was trashed. Lucas shot up from his chair. What? Emily's lips trembled. Someone had been inside. My things were thrown everywhere. The pictures of my parents, the only ones I had left, were ripped apart. And on the mirror they left a message. Lucas felt something dark coil in his chest. What did it say? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. You should have stayed dead. A heavy silence filled the room. Lucas's mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. His father might have been taken down, but the people who had helped him, the ones who had covered up Emily's past, they weren't done cleaning up loose ends, and Emily was their biggest threat. Lucas turned toward his desk, grabbing his phone. We have to leave, he said firmly. Emily blinked. What? Lucas dialed a number, his body moving on autopilot. If they're after you, they won't stop. We need to get somewhere safe. Emily hesitated, but the look in his eyes told her not to argue. Where would we even go? Lucas's jaw clenched. Somewhere they can't find us. The call connected. Mr. Montgomery? A voice on the other end answered. Lucas's grip tightened around the phone. I need a jet ready in the next hour. No records, no questions. Emily's breath hitched. Lucas! He turned to her, his expression unreadable. You wanted me to choose, didn't you? His voice was quieter now, but there was something unshakable in it. Between you and my family, Emily swallowed. Lucas, I made my choice, he interrupted, his eyes never leaving hers. Now let's go. For a moment, Emily just stared at him, as if trying to understand what this meant. Then finally she nodded. Lucas ended the call, his heart hammering. This wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about survival. As they stepped out into the night, a black SUV parked at the edge of the estate. Lucas froze, his instincts flaring. Inside, shadowed figures sat in silence, watching, waiting. His father's empire might have crumbled tonight, but the war was just beginning.